Thank you, Yogesh, and special thanks, I think, for organizing this series along with some other colleagues, because I think the significance of this series is that we discuss works by academics working in Ambedkar University, Delhi. But the significant part is that students will read parts of that work and critically respond to it. So I'm very happy and delighted to welcome Dr. Javed Iqbal Wani from the School of Law, Governance and Citizenship, and we are very, very thankful to you for agreeing to come to share your work and interact with students, and I'm really looking forward to a very, very fruitful discussion. Dr. Javed is an assistant professor, as I said, in the School of Law, Governance and Citizenship. He did his PhD from the University of London, and as a result of that, I think his first major monograph, which has come out, and it's called Sovereign Anxiety, Public Order and the Politics of Control in India, 1915 to 1955. So this is the book that we're going to discuss today. And at the outset, this is the book, let me say, this book is being published by Cambridge University Press in 2023. And at the outset, I'd like to say, before we actually critically discuss the book, that it's academically very, very sound, it's intellectually very, very stimulating, and I think it's extremely relevant for all of us as citizens, and I think that should become apparent as the discussion proceeds about the book. This book has an interesting time frame, Javed, isn't it? And I'll come back to it later on. It starts from 1915, just after the beginning of the First World War, at the time when the colonial state was very much there in India, and it ends in 1955. 1955, just a few years after independence. So I find this time frame extremely interesting, and I'm sure you have more to say on that later on. So the book is, as I read it, and as Javed himself says at various points in this book, it's a book about extraordinary laws in India. He traces the evolution of a legal framework in India from the late 18th century as the East India Company, which was a trading company as we all know, it became a territorial entity in the second half of the 18th century. So from trade to conquering and administering territory in India, that transition, in that transition, and in the carving out of the company Raj and subsequently of the imperial state in India in the late 19th century, law, as we all know, played an extremely significant role. While we as Indians, we can say that we became subjects of British Empire, but it was also an empire which was very eager to claim legitimacy of rule, and law was a major instrument, if I may say, in that. So turning us into legal subjects, that process also from the late 18th century and in the early 19th century has been reviewed, traced by Javed in this book. He talks about the way law, subjecthood, all that starts happening once the codification of law starts happening from the late 18th century, various law commissions, then reform through law, definitions of private property in law. He also makes a very, very interesting distinction, which again I would expect that you expand on this, rule of law and rule by law. All that happens, and then he gets into the major arguments of his book, and he discusses thugging in the 1830s. And finally, as we know, from the 1860s onwards, we have a legal code in India which gets transformed. There are various law commissions. But apart from the general evolution of law, what this book does is to talk about those situations in which the colonial state actually legislated in extraordinary ways to deal with a whole range of situations. And Javed's argument is that this anxiety, which is also part of his book, this sovereign anxiety seems to increase from the second decade of the 20th century, and therefore bans, section 144, all these things become part of the colonial regime's legal practice. So the book is about the promulgation of these extraordinary laws for exceptional circumstances. And yet, what I found interesting, there are some fascinating cases in this book which also talk about the quotidian or the daily life of law in India and its practice, and what it meant for us before 1947. And did it substantially change after 1947? Surely we know it wouldn't have changed overnight. But what were the anxieties of the nascent independent state in India? He does it with examples and case studies from UP primarily. There is a lot of archival work in this book, and I could smell, as a historian, I could smell the archives in his book, especially the state archives, the dusty files which you must have seen, for example, in the Uttar Pradesh state archives in Lucknow and elsewhere. So it's archivally very, very rich. It talks about law in exceptional circumstances, and it talks about the daily experience of law in the early years of independent India. So what were the changes, what were the continuities? These are all issues which we will have an opportunity to discuss today. I'll come back with more comments and my questions. But before that, not assuming that people have read this book or necessarily they are familiar with this argument, with his argument, I would request Dr. Javed to talk about the book, to introduce the book, and in about 15-20 minutes, if he can give us a sense of what his research findings are, what his propositions are, and then it will be followed by comments from two students who have closely read two chapters, Ayush and Swaliha. They will respond in about 10 minutes each, and then we'll come back, for a discussion after that. Over to you, Javed. Thanks.
Thank you, Professor Sanjay, for a very kind introduction. I apologize in advance. I have not been feeling well for the past 20 days, and unfortunately, right at the moment when my talk is due, my vocal cords are slowly giving up. So, with that apology and disclaimer in place, let me begin by thanking the Department of History, Ambedkar University, Delhi, for taking this initiative of organizing this book discussion, and particularly to Yogesh, who on one fine afternoon while he was passing by, so I suggested, okay, can we have this conversation? He said, yeah, why not? And here we are today, this as a reality. So, and also in advance, thanks to the student discussants who will be discussing two chapters. I'm really looking forward to your observations on the case studies that are in consideration in those chapters. this particular book emerges out of my PhD work, and rather than talking about research as some kind of a flashy, very sophisticated product, I like to see research as something which is very organic to the being of the researcher. So therefore the subjectivity of the researcher is very important in terms of what topic they choose, what field they choose, what questions they choose. And the questions that I have dealt with in this book are also something which is close to my heart in terms of both as a citizen of the country, but also as a subject of the law. And this particular project came into being when I was still a student at JNU, and I was doing my MPhil. The funny thing is that this work is followed up by an MPhil dissertation in political science, and the funny thing is that the title of my MPhil dissertation was Suicide Bombing and the Modern Nation State. So I'm already interested in the question of violence, and both violence from the state and the non-state is something that academically, intellectually, politically interests me a lot. And this context of violence brings up or throws up questions sometimes which we haven't thought about, right? So in political science at that point of time, there was a debate going on around about the question of state of exception. State of exception. Now the state of exception is a conversation that gained traction with the works of Carl Schmitt, and then later when Giorgio Agamben picked up the debate and talked about state of exception after the arrival of the US Patriot Act, right? In a post 9/11 kind of a scenario. Now, this post 9/11 kind of a scenario threw up new political questions for all of us, right? This is the time when people are talking about terrorism, anti-terror laws, and new laws are being drafted, promulgated, legislated across countries around the globe. And the conversation about state of exception took a very weird turn, and people started talking about that this state of exception with the arrival of this US Patriot Act has opened up a new dimension of extraordinary laws, right? So in the state of exception, the argument that Carl Schmitt gave was from the premise of sovereignty, and he said that the sovereign is he who decides, right? And with the arrival of Agamben later and the reading of Carl Schmitt's political theology, Agamben kind of argued that, okay, it's all right that the sovereign decides the state of exception, but then in the post 9/11 scenario, what has happened is that the exception, which was the extraordinary, which was supposed to happen in extreme situations, has now become the norm, the rule, right? So the rule is generally like everybody lives in peace and there is no violence, right? But Agamben argued that in the post 9/11 scenario, this kind of invocation of extraordinary laws has become the norm, which means they are now invoked as if it is normal, and in the everyday, in the quotidian, it's all right to invoke those laws because the context is itself extraordinary. Now this argument did not convince me a lot, because if you are a student of history, and especially if you are a student of political history, and if you have any understanding of history of colonialism, not only of South Asia, but colonialism of Africa, the African experience of colonialism, the Australian experience of colonialism, the Latin American experience of colonialism. So if you take the history of colonialism in its totality, you would know that different kinds of empires on various pretexts had created legal extraordinarynesses in these kind of very special localities in order to make their own rule palatable, right? Palatable in the sense, like, of course, the connection or the relationship between the colonizer and the colonized is, of course, a relationship of inequality. It is an asymmetrical relationship, right? It's a relationship of the domination of one over the other. And of course, violence is something which mediates this relationship very, very clearly. And all of us remember Ranjit Guha's dominance without hegemony. So domination is an important aspect of colonialism, no matter wherever you look at it across the globe. So this question of state of exception became very important to me, and it doesn't have to be extraordinary. That was my point. Only the laws which are extraordinary are not the only extraordinary things that are there in the legal artifact. There are very ordinary, quote unquote, I'm using this within quotes, there are very ordinary things there which might not be extraordinary but yet have extraordinary tendencies. And therefore I dwell on a particular section of the erstwhile IPC. Unfortunately now we have the BNS, the Bharatiya Nyaya Sanhita. So section 144 I think has now become the new section 163 or something. So section 144 of the Criminal Procedure Code is a very interesting section, right? So when we were students, every time we were going to certain kind of protests, marches, so every time you are confronted with this state in fancy dress, the police, and suddenly you will see that banner, section 144, as if suddenly my rights as a citizen are taken away, as if all the right to protest, to voice are taken away, and I'm almost in a space where anything can happen to me, right? Whereas ordinarily people who are going to these protests, people who are participating in these protests, were just making demands, demands which are legitimate demands as citizens of any country. But the invocation of section 144 suddenly makes a very ordinary situation into very extraordinary circumstance, right? And this is not one of those emergency declarations of Indira Gandhi, you need that extraordinariness to invoke a state of emergency. Just invoking an ordinary section of the CRPC like section 144 can create extraordinary circumstances. And you never know, if you are in that space, in what ways the situation is going to unfold. Now from here I come to the second aspect of this extraordinariness, is because the erstwhile Indian Penal Code and the Criminal Procedure Code also was crafted in the context of colonialism, right? So colonialism has this very interesting story to itself, that when it creates these British, when they came to India, they had to draft these laws not for white men. They're drafting these laws for a population whom they have been dominating, and they want to dominate further. However, ideologically, they are coming from that imperial location, from the metropolis, which is claiming to be liberal, which is claiming to be celebrating something called the rule of law, which is the land of Jeremy Bentham, right? The philosophic calculus, the law reforms, the balance of power in terms of division of power, right? Like executive, judiciary, so everything balances each other up. But here the situation is that they are saying, now this is point number one. Point number two, the British, as soon as they start drafting a legal code for the Indians, what was their argument? Their argument was, these quote unquote princely states, these feudal societies, these societies of the Nawabs, this Mughal Farmans, whatever way they've been governing this territory, there's a lot of discretion in these people, right? They say, oh, Sharia, wherever Sharia was functioning, what is Sharia? Sharia is like, there's so much of inequality in terms of the application of law, right? So to one person, the person who holds power holds the discretion, right? If they don't like you, they can give you capital punishment. If they like you, maybe they say pay 50,000 rupees, and so they say this ordinary local native, quote unquote native way of justice is very discretionary in nature. So therefore this colony requires a scientific legal code based on the Benthamian principles, where there is certainty of law, there is predictability of law, there is repeatability of law, there is fecundity of law, there is severity of law, yet there is sense of justice in law. Because the British argued that the Indians at the point of time did not have any of these, and least of all scientificity of law. No, they don't have that. But the interesting thing is that when you look at these particular sections like section 144, what do they tell us? They tell us a very interesting story about both colonial power and the foundations of legality and legal regime in contexts which have seen, or in cultural contexts, in locational contexts, which have experienced colonialism. Which is, despite that they were creating these very certain laws, predictable laws, scientific laws, You see, in laws across the Indian Penal Code, across the Criminal Procedures Code, there is something called discretion. Many of the things are left to the discretionary powers of the officer on duty at that point of time. If the law is supposed to be so certain, so predictable and so consistent, then what is this discretion doing in this so-called quote-unquote scientific law of the British that they created for this Indian colony, right? In section 144, many of the circumstances to determine what has happened, what will happen, who is who, in these circumstances is also dependent on the officer on duty. They have the discretionary powers to decide whether the situation is extraordinary or not, right? Whether something is a threat to public order or not. There is no certainty to determine whether something actually is a crisis of public order or not. Yet it is completely dependent on that officer on the location, and they're saying discretionary powers. Now, as soon as you see discretionary powers, it tells us two things. What is this discretion in law? Because law is supposed to be clear, direct, right? It has to give particular values to particular acts, particular circumstances. What is this discretionary power then doing in these laws? Discretionary power, if it is there, it means that either law doesn't want to address certain questions, or law is one possibility, right? And I'm not going to give any of the possibilities. I'm saying these are possibilities. Either there is something that the law doesn't want to talk about, or there is something which the law doesn't know how to talk about. There is deliberation in both the aspects. You don't want to talk about certain things, or you do not know how to talk about certain things. In both the circumstances, you leave it to the discretion of the party. Number two, if you have to theoretically, conceptually look at this idea of discretion, what is discretion then? Is it a deficit of law? Because things are not clear, right? If things were clear, they would have said this is how it is to be done. It is just leaving it to the discretion, which means it is making it ambiguous. So the ambiguity can tell us either what is it then theoretically. Theoretically, is it the deficit of law, or is it the excess of law? Because both possibilities are there again. It can be deficit because the law doesn't know how to fill this gap, this lacuna, or it is the law knows what it is, but it wants to go beyond what it has in its kitty to deal with it. So therefore it wants to go further, therefore it is the excess of law. Now, not defining, it can be anything. To do whatever it likes in the name of discussion is also another kind of possibility that exists in this circumstance. Now, in this book I talk about the Lahore conspiracy case. I begin with that. I talk about labor riots, because these are the contexts in which these kinds of laws are invoked. I talk about communal tensions. I talk about sectarian tensions, and then I move on to very specific quotidian examples, and then the two chapters that the students will discuss towards the end are to another forms of policing and maintenance of public order towards the later part of, like, let's say, late colonial and early post-colonial era, right? But today I want to discuss something very specific, which is that we talk about public order in these grand, spectacular terms, right? You look at the Kakori case, the Lahore conspiracy case, you look at these communal riots in Bombay, you look at communal riots in Kanpur, in Lucknow, the grand stories, right? But I want to tell you a very different, ordinary, everyday story, which is like, if you have read Ranjit Guha's Chandra's Death. When I read Ranjit Guha's Chandra's Death, the chapter in Subaltern Studies, and when I bumped on this file in the UP State Archives, it was like as if Guha has come in front of me and told me, Javed, this is how we need to treat this file as. Because this is like something that I've learned by reading that article. So I'll tell you a very simple story. I'm sitting in the archive, doing my larger event, spectacular event, looking for these spectacular events, creating these narratives of riots, big riots, police record, judiciary records, political records, home records, newspaper, reporting on that. And then this भैया, the चपरासी भैया, the peon who is in the UP state, he says, sir, ये भी देख लीजिए, ये भी कुछ पड़ा हुआ है आपके इसमें. And it's like very, very rusty file, like full of fungus. I actually got another throat infection while looking at them, because it's full of all kinds of fungus, Nobody has looked at those files. Somebody has maybe had splashed tea on those files, and So after much effort, this small stack of files, it was typed Peter Budge FIR Inquiry Committee, just very cryptic. So I started reading. So in order to make sense, I have to go through the entire file, page by page, line by line. So the story is like this, and this is not a story of grand big leaders like Gandhi, Nehru. This is not a story of communist activists doing some kind of a revolutionary stuff on the streets. This is not even about the rioters who were participating in riots on the street and therefore doing something. You know how we understand history in the 40s and 30s, and this is ordinary of an very ordinary person. His name is Peter Budge. Peter Budge is an elderly person. So this context is it's 1945. Communal tensions are increasing. In the city of Lucknow, communal tensions are at their peak, and the police and the district administration has imposed Section 144 because there are rumors that religious communities are gathering weapons in preparation for riots. So the administration has also imposed Indian Arms Act so that people do not have weapons. If they have weapons, they have to report to the police station. They have to report everything to the police in terms of letting them know how the situation is going to pan out. And nobody's allowed in number of 3 or more on the streets. Everybody's supposed to be staying inside. It's a situation of crisis, right? Administrative crisis, political crisis. Now Peter Budge, who is an elderly person, he got bored of Section 144 being in the home. He decides that enough is enough. It's been quite a few days. I'm going to take a walk. I'm going to go for evening walk. I'm tired of staying in home. He takes his walking stick, which already tells us that he's already pretty old. Okay? He's not somebody in the 30s or 40s or even 50s. He has a walking stick. How do we know that? Through the FIR. So Peter Budge decides to take his walking stick, goes on a walk. In the street, he is confronted by 2 police constables. Okay? 2 police constables. Funny thing, one constable is called Muhammad Sagir and another constable is called Dudnath. And Muhammad Sagir and Dudnath are the 2 constables who stop whom? Peter Budge. Right? Interesting situation. They say, where are you going? He said, I'm going for a walk. He said, don't you know there is Section 144 applicable here? How dare you roam on the streets? And these guys are basically having just a banter with him, right? And this elderly person is already irritated, and he had a bit of an argument with these 2 constables. As soon as he has this argument with the constables, things suddenly get out of hand. The constables immediately arrest him for violating Section 144, took him to the Kaisarganj police station and filed a complaint. Okay. Now how do we know this story? Because then we look at the FIR. The FIR says Peter Budge, Rang Savla, which means bokai skin, witty skin, is a resident of so and so locality, is found walking on the street in violation of Section 144 and in violation of Indian Arms Act because his walking stick was recorded as a weapon. See, discretion. The possibility of things going haywire in very ordinary of the circumstances. You never know how extraordinariness is going to play itself out in these circumstances. Now, this is not only the worst thing that could have happened to Peter Budge. Now, Peter Budge, when this complaint is taken to the Muharrir is the clerk of the police station. Now, at that point of time, the Muharrirs, they were writing in Nastaliq, which is a particular style, freestyle handwriting, whether derived from Persian, mostly from Persian, and then deployed to Urdu transcription also. Now, in Nastaliq, when you write Peter, so for example now, Dudnath, Sagir Ahmed do not know anything about Peter Budge. What kind of name is this? Peter in Lucknow? and Baj. Wait, it's very difficult to. It's like the person looks like Samla Rang, which is mocha skin, but the name doesn't fit the skin color, right? Doesn't fit the visual identity of the person. Now I said, "Tumhara naam kya? What is your name?" He said, "Peter Baj." His name got recorded as Peer Baksh. And the funny thing is that in Urdu Nastalik, when you write like this, pe, ye, and re, there's a little bit of te on top. If you miss that, the Peter can easily be read as Peer, right? So it was Peter Baj, but now this person, because he or she maybe definitely doesn't want to hear Peter, because he's not wired to hear Peter, right? So therefore his Peter Baj gets recorded as Peer Baksh. What are the chances? What are the chances of Peter Baj getting recorded as Peer Baksh? And this kind of a scam did not only happen with Peter Baj. His father's name was also subjected to similar kind of a error. His father's name is Tommy Baj. And the Muharrir writes in Nastalik again, Tommy Baksh. Stage number 1. This person is now in the FIR, in the complaint, they are already saying that this person might be a little bit psychologically disturbed, right? If you are saying by law that a person is psychologically disturbed, then the person needs to be medically examined, taken to a psychiatrist, and if the psychiatric report comes in a particular way, then the course of law takes a different direction, right? But they don't wait for it. They take this person based on this kind of a report of the Muharrir. With that challan, they take him to the jail. Okay, lock up. Yahan se transfer karke they have taken him to jail. Now this scandal doesn't stop here. There's a second layer of misspelling that happens with Peter Baj. In the jail, they look at Peter Baj, son of Tommy Baj, Peer Baksh, son of Tommy Baksh. And here, the Baksh again, because it doesn't have to be sheen like this, it can just like that. In jail, authorities record the same person in Peer Bajr, son of Tommy Bajr. Now imagine one person in original, Peter Baj, son of Tommy Baj. In the police station, he is Peer Baksh, son of Tommy Baksh. In the jail, the same person is Peer Bajr, son of Tommy Bajr. Now, law needs to have one body, one name. But here we have one body, 3 names. How do you make sense of this? And how do you then track this person through this legal bureaucracy then? The trial goes to the court. Another mishap. Maybe this person has the worst Rahu Ketu going against him, just as a figure of speech. So the time he got arrested maybe had been the worst time of his life. So when his trial goes to court, it's not only that the judge got replaced again and again and again, so there was never one judge hearing his case all the time. But eventually after a long time, so every time his file will go to the court, they are looking for Peer Bajr, son of Tommy Bajr. Peter Baj, son of Tommy Baj, is sitting in jail. The judge is issuing summon after summon after summon for Peer Bajr, son of Tommy Bajr. They are going to the locality where he lives and they are asking, do you know any Peer? They say, nobody by the name of Peer lives here. Nobody by the name of Peer Bajr lives here. Because they know Peter Baj. They don't know Peer Bajr. Right? So after a while, the policemen say that the person is untraceable. See, this is another challenge of legal bureaucracy. How much do you agree with what the bureaucracy is telling you? If the person is sitting in jail, why are you issuing summons and sending the summons to the person's locality to trace the person? The person is already in jail. But because there is so much of miscommunication between different wings of legal bureaucracy that it became almost impossible to trace this person called Peter Budge in the bureaucratic setup of United Provinces. Now Peter Budge is in jail. In his absence, one grand event takes place, and the grand event is the partition of the country. But also that India now has become independent, and a citizen of this country has spent in jail for no fault of his and missed the most important aspect of being a citizen of an independent country while being in jail. Right? So after this, if you look at this particular instance, eventually Peter Budge is presented in front of a judge, and one judge eventually, after a couple of hearings, he said, where is this person? And the jail authorities discovered that there is one person excess in jail, right? One person is this person is excess in jail, and what do we do with this person? Because some accounting has to happen in law. So there is extra body. What is this extra body? This extra body is then taken in front of the judge. The judge determines that this person has already spent much more in jail than he would have had he been found guilty of what he is accused of. The judge on the spot, again, by using his discretionary powers, whose judge's discretionary powers, to release the person on the spot. The story started with the discretionary powers of the policeman and ended with the discretionary powers of the judge. Right? Now what does this kind of tell us? This tell us that three kinds of observations can be made from this Peter Budge's story. Right? First level of observation can be about the nature of the bureaucracy of paperwork as such, right? These papers we think are so innocent, but they are not. Please never take them lightly. One wrong spelling, one wrong data entry can create problems of enormous levels. So the first level is about the nature of bureaucracy of paperwork. The second is about the repercussions of official discretion on ordinary lives, on very ordinary persons like Peter Budge, which is you and I also. Third is also regarding the question of justice and the procedure, particularly in late colonial India. How much it has changed as of today, I don't know, but we have lessons to learn from Peter Budge's story. Now, British colonial government in India, it saw its bureaucracy and the paperwork that this bureaucracy generated as one of its strengths, right? Because there was files, there was vouching of the vouching, there was signatures, there were counter signatures, everything was set in concrete, right? Fixity of meaning, determination of meaning. So the entire purpose of such an administrative system was based on what the British claimed were the establishment of a depoliticized bureaucracy, an impartial judiciary, quote unquote rule-bound norms, and a very dutiful police. This is what they argued. This order of files, there are two kinds of order. One order is on the street, but there is another order that we see through Peter Budge's life. This circumstance is the order of files, right? So the order of files, it breathed life into such a bureaucratic order, and it was argued to be laden with facts. Because what is a file? Facts, right? So these facts and therefore truth, legal formality and the bureaucratic management of life, as the case of Peter Budge reveals, aimed to reinforce elements of precise control at each level, right? At each level you see as if bureaucracy has a precise control over the events, whether it's on the street, whether it's in the police station, whether it's in the jail, whether it's in the court. But we see that nothing is in control. Everything is haywire, right? So legal formality and bureaucratic management of life, this case tells of Peter Budge, it aimed to reinforce elements of precise control at each level. Although legal procedure specified the rules of conduct, the conduct itself was not always legal, right? So throughout this Peter Budge's story and the inquiry report that you can read in the chapter, the more details, what it challenges is a convenient understanding of colonial bureaucracy, and therefore exposing the fictitious nature of the bureaucratic paperwork that is involved. This case will tell you that bureaucratic paperwork which is supposed to be so certain is actually half fiction. Okay. So the colonial experience has already kind of extended the reach of bureaucracies to the widest extent possible. Okay. These extensions, especially in the first half of the 20th century, they brought new strengths and they brought new weaknesses of the state to the front, to the surface. They not only opened up opportunities for corruption, but also for distortion of the procedure. Okay. Corruption here does not merely mean, monetarily or personal gain. But here I'm referring to corruption as practices that were either quasi-official, crypto-official, or just fictitious. These kinds of practices, I argue, were constitutive of the emergent post-colonial state. Informal rules, but also accompanied by false records, were commonplace in clerical practice. And Peter Budge's ordeal shows us that in situations of public disorder, public officials or police officials, they could declare just somebody's presence as a violation of public tranquility, or declare an object like his walking stick as a weapon. What is pertinent here in this conversation is the basis on which such action or such implementation of discretion could be taken. Charging a person with an extraordinary kind of crime is one thing, and then proving the crime are two different things, right? And these are two different aspects of the administrative machinery. Ideally, in any bureaucratic setup, a respite from injustice, if somebody says that injustice has been done to me, so in ordinary parlance, injustice could be a respite from injustice could be expected by challenging the official prejudice which is involved. But in this case, the Peter Budge's case, official incompetence, both in language and in law, they both further complicated the process. So what you see that the career of public order laws, forget about the spectacular side of it, but look at the quotidian side of it, the everyday, the ordinary side of it. The career of these public order laws that granted these discretionary powers to various officials, it emerges, and here my argument comes, is that it emerges as a corrupt and potent remnant of colonial legality. And the funny thing is that you have the BNS now. To decolonize law, one of the important things could have been to get rid of sections like section 144, but everything else has been retained. All the colonial remnants, including section 144, is retained under a different section right now. So such laws, what do they highlight? They highlight the significance of the performative aspect of state power, and they enable a disciplinary and a punitive image of the state. Illegal detentions, bureaucratic violence due to the promulgation of public order laws, they demonstrated the state's capacity to discipline its citizen with disregard for the consequence of these laws, of such laws on the lives of the people, and the supplementary discretionary powers that were granted to various officials. The state and its practices are always written into ordinary lives. But Peter Budge's story enables us to make those practices visible. It helps us to make those practices which are opaque visible, suddenly visible in front of us. So Peter's ordeal highlights that the spectacular in law trumped the substantive, and disciplining the city undermined the liberty of ordinary citizens. This is a paradox in law. Peter Budge's story demonstrates that the state and its legal machinery were often internally incoherent, and its officials enjoyed unchecked powers and followed practices which were contrary to the claims made by the state. Individual officials like policemen, the clerks in police station and in the courts and in jails, and even the judges acted in ways that circumvented the stated objectives of the state, which is justice. So in this bureaucratic paperwork, you have two things. So in law, justice has two aspects. One is the procedural, and the second is the substantive. In Peter Budge's story, both procedural and substantive sides of law failed miserably. Thank you.
Thank you, Javed. And this fascinating case illustrates so many things that you've been arguing in this book. May I now request Ayush Singh? He's a second year MA History Program student, and he will give his observations on another chapter of this book, and that will be followed by Swaliha on another chapter, and let's take them together. So Ayush, may I request you to come here?
He can sit here.
सर, तो मुझे सर का वर्क बहुत इंटेलेक्चुअली स्टिमुलेटिंग लगा। तो दो पैराडाइम्स हैं जिस पर मैं लार्जली अपने ऑब्जर्वेशन और डिस्कशन को आगे बढ़ूंगा। एक जो सर ने कहा कोटोडियन एस्पेक्ट्स हैं जो लीगैलिटी के, मतलब हम बड़े जब अगर एंटी नेशनल या एंटी कॉलोनियल फिगर्स की बात कर रहे हैं तो हम गांधी, नेहरू या पटेल की बात नहीं कर रहे हैं, या फिर अगर हम स्टेट की भी बात कर रहे हैं तो स्टेट का नेचर कैसे बहुत अलग है। तो इसको सर मतलब दर्शाने के लिए सर का ही एक एक्सट्रैक्ट है, मैं उसको पढ़ देता हूँ, जहाँ पे जो कॉलोनियल ट्राइब्स है उसकी फ्रूगैलिटी को और कैसे वो फ्रॉडुलेंट है एक तरीके से डिस्पाइट बीइंग एस्टैब्लिश्ड बाय रूल ऑफ लॉ। तो सर यहाँ पे जो संजय सर का सवाल था रूल ऑफ लॉ और रूल बाय लॉ में जो डेफिनेशन या डिफरेंशिएशन है वो कैसे एक्सटेंड होता है, तो उसका एक छोटा सा मतलब उनको एग्जाम्पल यहाँ मिलता है, मैं उसको पढ़ देता हूँ शब्दशः। In a colonial context, the juridical political paradox remained that trials were not necessarily fair, even though they were conducted as per the established rules. When the aim of the law was power and not justice, the provision of trial did not make the law fair. तो ये colonial paradigm है, ये colonial state का अपना मनोभाव है जो कि हमको दिखता है। अब इस किताब में एक बहुत इंटरेस्टिंग चीज़ जो मेरे लिए बहुत नहीं है, क्योंकि मैं मॉडर्न इंडिया में बहुत ज़्यादा मतलब उस तरीके से इंटरेस्ट लेता हूँ कि पोस्ट कॉलोनियल स्टेट में क्या ट्रांजिशन हो रहा है। वो जो एक होप है, वो जो एक एंजाइटी है, वो जो एक्सिलरेशन है, एंथुजियाज्म है कि नया स्टेट है, पीपल्स विल है, स्टेट सोवरेनिटी और पीपल्स सोवरेनिटी क्या वो एक है, उस चीज़ को बहुत अच्छे से सर ने मतलब आज मैं जिस चैप्टर को पढ़ा उसमें बहुत अच्छे से दर्शाया। तो मतलब मेरे चैप्टर में हम लोग यूपी की बात कर रहे हैं और यूपी 1948 की बात कर रहे हैं, मतलब आज़ाद हो गया है और यूपी अपने आप टर्मोइल से गुजर रहा है। यहाँ पार्टीशन है, कम्युनल स्ट्राइफ है, केओस है, राइटस मॉब्स हैं, सब चीज़ चल रहा है, मास एक्सीडेंस है और इसमें गोविंद वल्लभ पंत साहब की सरकार है। तो इस सरकार के बीच में ये कैसे हैंडल कर रही है डीलिंग्स को और वो कितना अलग नहीं है। तो सर एक जगह कहते हैं कि पोस्ट कॉलोनियल स्टेट है, क्या वो मान लेना चाहिए कि कॉलोनियल स्टेट के अपैरेटस से बहुत ज़्यादा अलग है? तो सर कहते हैं कि नहीं, वो ट्वीक एंड ब्रांच रिफॉर्म तो हुआ ही नहीं था कभी, तो वो कभी अलग है नहीं। और वो सिडेक्शन जो है एक्स्ट्रा लीगैलिटी की, एक्स्ट्राऑर्डिनरी लॉ की, जो नॉर्म है एक्स्ट्राऑर्डिनरी लॉ का, वो डे टू डे गवर्नेंस में बहुत अच्छे से झलकता है। तो जब गोविंद वल्लभ पंत साहब की सरकार आती है तो वो 3 कानून बेसिकली ले आती है। पहला कानून जो है वो विलेज कमिटीज एस्टैब्लिश करने की है, VDS, विलेज डिफेंस कमिटीज, इन द ल्यू ऑफ जो अटैक है, जो मॉब है या डेकॉयट्स है। और इसमें बहुत इंटरेस्टिंग दूसरी बात अगेन ये है कि डेकॉयट का कैरेक्टर कैसे एक एंटी कॉलोनियल डिफाइंट कैरेक्टर है जो रूरल हिंटरलैंड में डिफाइंस को पोर्ट्रे कर रहा है। मतलब गांधी, नेहरू और बाकी लोग जो हैं कॉस्मोपॉलिटन एंटी कॉलोनिज्म के एक बहुत बढ़िया रिप्रेजेंटेशन है। लेकिन जो VDS है या फिर आप डेकॉयट का कैरेक्टर है वो हिंटरलैंड्स में जाकर उसको रिप्रेजेंट कर रहा है। और इसमें अशफाकुल्ला खान है, राम प्रसाद बिस्मिल है, चंद्रशेखर आज़ाद है, सबका एग्जाम्पल सर देते हैं। तो ये जो कैरेक्टर है अपने आप में इतना इंट्रीगिंग है, इतना इनिग्मेटिक है कि ये जैसे ही सरकार बदलती है, जैसे ही आज़ाद हो जाता है भारत, ये अपने आप में पब्लिक ऑर्डर के लिए एक न्यूसेंस बन जाता है, वही कॉलोनियल स्टेट के लिए। तो उसको कैसे फाइट बैक करने के लिए एक लॉ लाया जाता है विलेज डिफेंस कमेटी का, उस पर बहुत अच्छी बात है सर। और मतलब एक डिस्ट्रस्ट जो है, मतलब मैं इस पर थोड़ा सा आपसे और जानना चाहूँगा कि ये डिस्ट्रस्ट सर सिर्फ डेकॉयत के कैरेक्टर से ही इतना ज़्यादा इम्ब्यूड है या और भी सोशल ग्रुप्स हैं? मतलब आपने क्रिमिनल ग्रुप्स में क्रिमिनल ट्राइब्स एक्ट की बात की है, ठगी ऑपरेशन की बात की है, आपने सर एक और जगह बात की है कि कांग्रेस सरकार गैर कांग्रेसी सरकार या गैर कांग्रेसी मोबिलाइजेशन को भी क्रिमिनलाइज कर रही है उस तरीके से, लेकिन आपने एक्सपैंड नहीं किया इस चैप्टर में। मैं उस तरफ आपका थोड़ा जानकारी जानना चाहूँगा सर। एक विलेज डिफेंस कमेटी है, दूसरा पीआरडी है, मतलब हिंद रक्षक दल पुरुषोत्तम दास टंडन का है, प्रांतीय रक्षक दल, वो कैसे अपने आप में यूपी को मिलिटराइज कर रही है। तो जीनियोलॉजी जो है, आज हम उत्तर प्रदेश को जिस प्रकार से समझ रहे हैं, एक बहुत ही हिंसक, एक मैस्कुलिन, एक वायलेंट, मिलिटरिस्टिक सोसाइटी है, उसकी कहीं ना कहीं जीनियोलॉजी जो है 1948 में पोस्ट कॉलोनियल सरकार भी डाल रही है। वो सोसाइटी को अपने आप मिलिटराइज कर रही है, वो सोसाइटी में आर्म्स दे रही है। और एक जगह तो मतलब सर ने एक्सर्ट में डाला है कि ठाकुर फूल सिंह का एक कैरेक्टर है जो यूपी लेजिस्लेटिव असेंबली में ये कहता है कि एक शार्प एज्ड वेपन भी हमें दे देना चाहिए, गांव गांव बांट देना चाहिए, ताकि डकैत के कैरेक्टर से हम लड़ सकें। तो मिलिटराइजेशन का जो अपनी खूबियां हैं या अपनी नाकामियां हैं, वो यूपी लेजिस्लेचर के अंदर की बात हो रही है, और वो कैसे मतलब रूरल हिंटरलैंड तक पहुंच रहा है प्रांतीय रक्षक दल के माध्यम से। और तीसरा सर जो मेरे को सबसे ज्यादा इंट्रिगिंग इसमें लगा कि जो सोशल पेस्ट का कैरेक्टर है, यही डकॉयत जो है, अब जब 2 एक्ट्स पास हो चुके हैं तो अब सिडक्शन जो है, अब चूंकि कॉलोनियल आर्ट ऑफ गवर्नेंस इतने समय तक रह चुकी है, तो पोस्ट कॉलोनियल सरकार उस सिडक्शन से बाहर नहीं आ पा रही है। तो एक जगह वो लॉ प्रोमलगेट कर रही है जहाँ पे एक सोशल पेस्ट का कैरेक्टर इन्वेंट कर रही है कि दीज आर द पीपल हु शुड नॉट बी पार्ट ऑफ द सोसाइटी। और इसमें सर फूको का एग्जांपल लेते हैं कि अब नॉर्मेलिटी को अगर हमें डिस्क्राइब करना है तो अब नॉर्मल का कैरेक्टर बहुत जरूरी है। तो फॉर द स्टेट ऑफ गवर्नेंस इट इज वेरी नेसेसरी टू हैव द अबनॉर्मल टू कल्टिवेट द नॉर्मल सिटीजनरी। तो यहाँ पे सोशल पेस्ट के कैरेक्टर से हम उस पर बात कर रहे हैं। और सर एक लास्ट चीज जो है, मतलब स्टेट का, मतलब मैं जितना पढ़ पाया इसमें हर जगह मिलिटराइजेशन का एक थीम बहुत ज्यादा है। पोस्ट कॉलोनियल स्टेट का स्ट्रक्चर बहुत ज्यादा चेंज नहीं हो रहा, आर्म जो है पोस्ट कॉलोनियल स्टेट का वो हमेशा बढ़ता जा रहा है। इट इज एन एवरेज दैट इज ऑलवेज एक्सपैंडिंग बिहाइंड, इट इज लर्किंग इन द शैडोज, इट इज ऑलवेज देयर। तो ये सारी बातें थी। आई नो मेरा थोड़ा सा समरी टाइप का हो गया, बट इट इज सो मतलब रिविटिंग टू रीड कि पोस्ट कॉलोनियल सरकार कैसे अलग है। तो वो मनोभावना जो होती है मॉडर्न इंडिया के स्टूडेंट को, जो बिपिन चंद्रा पढ़कर आ रहा है, जो एंटी कॉलोनियल मूवमेंट से बहुत ज्यादा अपने आप को राबता रख रहा है, जो गांधी के कैरेक्टर के साथ है। इवन गोविंद वल्लभ पंत गांधी के साथ बहुत समय रहे, लेकिन गोविंद वल्लभ पंत इज द मतलब ही इज इन द हेल्म ऑफ दिस गवर्नमेंट, ही इज डूइंग ऑल दिस। लाल बहादुर शास्त्री का वो जहाँ पे वो नोट है मेमो, लाल बहादुर शास्त्री इज कॉलिंग दीस पीपल एज पेस्ट्स। मतलब वो जो एक कैरेक्टर है, जो विट्रियोल है सोसाइटी में, ये डीइडिफिकेशन जो हो चुका है पॉलिटिकल लीडर्स का, उसको भी कहीं ना कहीं इस मनोभाव को मेरे लिए तो तोड़ती है। तो ये कुछ बातें थी सर। और मैं एक चीज़ और चाहूँगा कि कंसेप्चुअल में इंट्रोडक्शन पढ़ रहा था, आई कुड नॉट अंडरस्टैंड सर हाउ डिड यू अप्लाई फूकोज आइडिया ऑफ गवर्नमेंटैलिटी। तो यही था सर, मतलब इस पर और कुछ होगा तो आई विल फॉलो बैक।
Yeah, now, yes. Thank you. Thank you.
I must say,
And
very impressed.
Very impressed.
Yeah.
And there is a lot for Javed to respond to. Yes. And now.
So actually,
Swaliha is
Swaliha.
She's our second year, third semester student. Please go ahead.
okay, so basically my discussion is in continuation of what Ayush have said, and I will discuss the chapter number 5, which is entitled as Mukhya and the Chaukidars, the understanding of the new sense of public order in the United Province from 1947 to 1955. So basically, firstly I would like to put up my experience that it was very fascinating to read the auxiliary institutions since since from bachelor's and from master's first year we are just focusing on the judiciary, on legislation, and how the laws are becoming the part of, or how the different institutions like census are becoming the part of to impose the power, or how the changing the laws or changing the decorum or administration is a part of the colonial strategy. But getting to know about the auxiliary institutions like Chaukidar and getting the new concept of Mukhya as well, it was very fascinating and enlightening for me to know all these things. And so firstly the chapter is talking about a nascent, a post-colonial nascent state which is very anxious, to put about a democratic system, which our newly democracy has been introduced. So it's very anxious ki how they should impose a democracy to society. Simultaneously, they are so anxious ki how by putting a democracy, they are so anxious that how they can control society and maintain the power, justice, and other things. Also, so there is the another thing is that it is also focusing ki how the colonial administration, how the post-colonial state is focusing on कि कौन सी चीज़ें उन्हें inherit करनी है colonial setup administration से और कौन सी उन्हें decolonize करनी है. And this thing we are get to know from the चौकीदारी system, from the चौकीदारी which has been completely abolished and replaced by the village constables. And there is so it firstly talks about चौकीदार कि चौकीदार कैसे एक institution था to have a vigilant, to have a surveillance on the tribes, on their own community, and how it is becoming a helpful thing for the Britisher itself to have a vigilant control over the tribal community as well. And so apparently they have also introduced this a good amount of pay to them so that they can be loyal to them, and they provide some certain kind of information from the society as well. But after the post-colonial state, I have got to know that it has been discontinued just because for the post-colonial state it is now becoming an impractical thing. How could one particular person who has the authority, but how can one person particularly know several things about a particular region, and then it is becoming so inefficient and also an uneconomic thing for the state as well. So apparently they have discontinued with an own state's institution like constables. So in that I have a very particular question about the institution of Mukhabri. So the चौकीदार्स have been abolished just because कि उनको इतना information नहीं था, they have to pay. But apparently the police have the institution like Mukhabri, the people who are providing the local information to them. So how much the police can trust them? So I have this question, how much they can trust, because they are not paying that. And again the corruption, again the manipulation of the facts, manipulation of the reports can be done through the Mukhabris. But that's my question. The another section which is dealing with the Mukhya, so that is very fascinating. So I have this kind of ideology, this kind of opinion कि the Mukhyas are always the village headmen and they are the caste panchayat head, always from the upper caste. But I got to know that they are from there's another institution of Mukhya which is now imposed through the CRPC Act and by the district magistrate. And there also a certain kind of debate and a tussle between whether they should keep a Mukhya and between the Mukhyas and the institution of Gram Panchayat as well. Because one institution you are seeing that it's a nominated person who is from coming through the district magistrate, and another one is a democratic institution. So again there's a tussle between how much there is involvement of Mukhya, how much there is involvement of Mukhya, and what are the role and responsibility of the Gram Panchayat for society. And simultaneously I have observed that how people are responding to this, because people are not trusting over Mukhya because they are the police informators, and just because they know that Panchayat is their own institution, their own democratically elective thing. So there's a thing between, but apparently there's a debate going on, and that's I have observed, and I had this question of Mukhabri that I have already told you.
Javed, thank you so much, Ms. Malik. Count yourself lucky. You have two extremely enthusiastic,
absolutely, very
young minds who've applied their, critical faculties, and they have questions. I suggest if you can respond to some of them, they can also respond, and after that we'll open it up and invite comments and observations and questions.
Hello, it working? Yeah. Thank you for your comments and yours too. First of all, close reading of the chapters it's very funny, when somebody reads your work and reads it back to you. It's a very surreal experience. But in terms of general responses, one of my intentions as a student of history is also to move away from the seductions of the trends. When we study history in classrooms, there are always certain trends that are shown to us. There are certain prisms through which we look at material. Somehow, as I said in the beginning, that the author or the subject utilizes or deploys their agency in particular ways to read the material that is at hand. That has played an important role in my reading of the material in that particular way. For me, individuals are important, and in Indian historiography we attribute too much significance to persons. We do not take into account sometimes very silly things can have grand impacts in terms of how we come to understand events, processes, institutions. And state as an institution and state power as its modality is a very, it's a very interesting discourse in Indian social sciences and humanities. Everybody is enchanted by this discourse. You do political science, you go to sociology, you go to anthropology, you go to history classroom. Everybody is somehow focused on state power, institutions, but they're very central. And the way we are taught to look at these, and my big thank you to anthropologists, because some of the works they have done in the recent decade have actually allowed us to look at, especially historians, to look at state power, institutions, processes in a completely different way. Right? So when I looked at this, so these files again, UP State Archives. So policing control is not only that Vardi wala policeman which is kind of controlling, and state never has that kind of resources to be able to in charge of things all the time. State is very interesting in the sense that it devises mechanisms, alternative mechanisms, because there is a lot of political economy at stake. It doesn't have that much resources. It doesn't want to deploy that many resources, yet wants to appear as if it is mighty. Right? It has that signature of power. Every time it acts or somebody acts in its name, it's a signature of power. Now the institutions like village defense committees, mukhyas and chowkidars, these are not institutions which will give you money, but these are institutions which gives you intimacy with state. Right? It creates an intimate relation. It is a different kind of a power trip, in that it bestows you a very different kind of a power, because it allows you to, despite being non-state, still being able to wield the power of the state on behalf of the state. And we are in India, we are obsessed with chowkidars, right? Recently we had "Main hi chowkidar," फिर चौकीदार चोर है. We're still obsessed. See, this figure has not gone out of our minds.
Yes.
Right? Chowkidar is a very important person, both as a concept, as a person, and as an institution. Right? So chowkidar, in that parlance, becomes that from within you, from within the natives. Somebody who hasn't crossed the line to this side completely, yet is completely observant of the other. So the arrival of the state with the arrival of the policeman is a different kind of signal, right? When the state has a very antagonistic relationship to the citizens or the subjects of the state doesn't want to be in an antagonistic circumstance all the time. Chowkidaris and mukhyas allows that. What do you say? When there is somebody to take the pressure, right? Somebody who acts as pressure, the pressure whales. So you conduct everyday policing, data collection, observation, surveillance. Yet, whenever the state wants, they can approach you to get data on it. But is this data reliable? There is a lot of debate on that also, because these chokidars, these mukhiyas, also utilized their position vis-a-vis their location in the local communities, and were not always truthful to the colonial state in terms of how they were providing data. If you read the chapters, they sometimes also fudge data, because these people also belong to religions, castes, communities, biradris, and they would respond to the question of the colonial state not always how the colonial state wanted, but sometimes they were also working as mediators of their own communities. So there are multiple functions happening at the same level. State being there despite not being there. Second, state allowing certain people a position of power so that a certain intimacy with state power is created. And third, a representative from amongst you, so that you don't trust us, you trust somebody from amongst you. Right? So all of these paradigms are operating when these kinds of institutions are happening. Now in the context that you're talking about the village defense committees, now village defense committees are, the new government doesn't have so many policemen. The circumstance is that, and in the opening paragraph of my book is that one of the meetings of these superintendent of police and IGPs of UP take place. And one of the major observation that this inspector general makes, he say, लोगों को लगता है कि आज़ादी का मतलब है कि लाइसेंस मिल गया इनको. That the meaning of freedom for these people, who are these people? These people are the citizens of this new free citizens now. So he's saying in this meeting, and this is home files, data, truth, bureaucratic truth, saying these people think that freedom is a license to do anything that they want. And anything that they want is actually the political questions that they had, the political expectations that they had out of this big grand narrative called freedom. And in the introduction itself, you will see that people wanted freedom, but nobody knew what to do with it when it arrived. And that is reflected in executive's archive, that is reflected in the judicial archive, that is reflected in the political archive.
You also have a fascinating example of A.K. Gopalan, the communist leader.
Yes.
If we have time, we'll mention that. Yeah.
Good.
Yeah.
So in terms of mukhbir, you talked about mukhbir. See, mukhbirs are people who are basically spies, right? Spies are spies. They are paid. Sometimes they are also criminals who are let out on the promise that you will keep on reporting on other criminal activities in the localities and will not put you behind bars. And sometimes if you give us important information, we will monetarily reward you, right? So mukhbir is a completely different category in that sense. It's a spy. Things happen in secret. But for chokidars and mukhiyas, they're also the nodal points between the village community and the colonial state, right? Mukhbir is not public. Mukhbir's life is not public. But of chokidars and mukhiyas, life is public.
So I wanted to draw on the village defense committee discussion. Sir, you said that there is a certain intimacy with the state that this grants. I agree with that, but there is also an issue that you underline in the chapter is that the state does not find reliable villagers who to arm. Who do you arm? And there you draw the reference from Carl Schmitt's idea that there needs to be again a binary between a friend and a foe to govern. So could you highlight more upon that? Why did the state not find reliable villagers if it granted certain intimacy to them?
See, that's a very interesting question also, and for me also it's a very interesting problem. The state always talks. Modern history, 20th century history always speaks to us. All the research papers, books, articles, newspaper archives, it tells us as if things are to take things at their face value, right? But nobody tells us about the wide gap that existed between the nascent post-colonial, and by post-colonial I just mean like one which has come out of the direct control of colonial powers, right? I don't mean political post-colonial theory or something like that. So the nascent post-colonial state and the free subjects. What was the relationship between the two? How was the state making sense of these free subjects now, and how are the free subjects making sense of the state? Right? In very interesting works like works of Rohit De, the people's, you see how ordinary citizens were making sense of the state. But nobody tells us how the state was making sense of the citizens. Through this village defense committees, it tells us how the state was making sense, because the state did not know what to do with this diverse set of citizens, right? The citizens had demands which were not resolved with the arrival of the independence, right? There were questions which were still like a remnant, like a remainder. वो division करते हो ना, end में रह जाएगा, उसको करना क्या है? What do you do with that? And the political class did not have answers for that. And when it wanted to establish state powers through like village defense committees, because the state was unable to fight the dacoits, the state realized in the process, through its own intelligence gathering, that there is no surety whether the state will actually get that kind of fidelity back from the free subjects, because the free subjects were suspicious of the state. The free subjects were actually more on the side of the ones who were challenging the state. The bandits. Because in one instance, so let me have this basic conversation with you. The state says there are dacoits. Now dacoits is a problem in these archives for the police officers. This is a problem for the IGPs, the superintendent of police, for the station house officer, for the inspector, right? It's not a problem for the ordinary people. It is a problem for the feudal lords who had some wealth, who had access to vast amounts of land, who were making other people work on their fields, who had gold and silver accumulated in their mansions, right? And these people were also serving as mukhiyas in certain areas. So their proximity to the state was certain. But the bandits were attacking either the police stations or these so-called feudal lords. So the state says we can't control them. What we do is that, and certain areas which are also not accessible to the police. There is a river, there is a ravine, right? So police cannot always rush to rescue people. So why don't we do this thing that we arm the local villagers? And how do we do that? Let's find one reliable person in one village so that they can be given one rifle, so that when the dacoits attack the village, these people along with other people will go for the rescue on whom the dacoits have attacked. Policy is created, the pilot is run, but they are unable to find one reliable villager. That's what the state archives tells us. The archive tells us that the police department fails to find reliable villagers, which is one reliable villager in each village. So who is reliable? Who are these free subjects of this nascent post-colonial independent India? And what is the relationship between the free subjects and the state? There is not, and in circumstances when people are willing to buy, they are saying, okay, in Malkhana we don't have so many guns, and the guns which are there in Malkhana also need to be repaired. So in order to repair them, there is another expense. So now let's ask people, why don't they buy a gun? We will issue them the license. But they have to promise that if the dacoits attack, they will go to the rescue of the village. People are saying, when we have to buy guns from our own pocket, why should we go to somebody else's rescue? Right? We'll go to the rescue if you are giving us guns and ammunition, and we are going to actually act because you are providing us resource. When we are buying the resource, when we are cultivating the resource, we are also being now threatened by the dacoits. Why should we go for rescuing and defending other people? So the state finds it almost impossible to find one reliable villager. This tells us a lot about, I don't need to say much about this. This tells us what the situation actually was.
Yes, it would be good if we get some responses, questions from those who are present here, and maybe online as well. So let's begin with Dr. Rajan. He has something to say.
Sure.
Hi, I'm Rajan Krishnan. It was a very fascinating book. I love the whole thing, particularly the idea of sovereign anxiety. But I'm only curious about one thing, that is this arbitrariness of power imported in life.
Arbitrariness?
This everyday life. There is certain arbitrariness of executive, judiciary,
Yeah.
even the legislature is arbitrary. So that kind of thing remains, in spite of this famous division of sovereignty into three pillars, whatever. So that is a known thing. So when you push for that, we are actually extending the argument of falsehood. And again, so did I hear you saying that you are not happy with everything? I'm curious. Why? Because, I'll just completely see. The conceptual notion of self-rule is what he is taking to task. But we are looking at the macrocosmic situation when such self-rule doesn't exist because of the so-called arbitrariness of power. So we are only extending from other side. And so where is the conflict, if at all? I heard you saying conflict.
See, when I said that, it's not that I do not agree with the works that they have done, but a particular kind of emphasis on state of exception, or the kind of emphasis on state of exception that has particularly happened after 9/11. And we are talking about 18th, 19th century colonial experience. So I think what I was trying to say was that even before Carl Schmitt and Agamben have theorized what they have theorized, the colonial archive already tells us that there is similar kind of theorization available, not only similar but actually much more potent. The possibilities, the variations, the gradations of state of exception that we see in the colonial archive are very interesting. That's all what I said. See, so their arguments are interesting, right? But they happen at a particular point of time. Agamben becomes more relevant post 9/11, right? Carl Schmitt in the 1930s, 40s already with the political theology.
Instances are different.
Yeah.
But all of us are talking about that sovereignty cannot be dissolved in the myth of immanence of self. That's the only other.
Yeah.
So they are also they are talking about certain instances, certain schemata. We are talking about this Chandras, this kind of
Yes.
situations, subaltern and micro history and so on.
The framework I agree with. It's an important concept. But what I'm saying is that there is another, if as a student of modern Indian history,
Yes.
there is a different variation which is possible of state of exception. And that is by looking at this archive. That's all I'm saying. Concept is potent.
Actually, this is such a oxymoron that in telecommunications, there's a form of strike called work to do. The strike itself is known as work to do. So that the union will say, if you don't agree to these demands, we will do work to rule from tomorrow. So they are not saying they want to work. They are saying that we are going to work to rule, which means no work will happen. So the rules are such that ambiguities are such that if I do only work according to rule, the work will stop. So that is this between the executive and the application of law and the law inscription of law itself. There's a wide gap where arbitrariness is essentially resides. So I'm thinking that we are rather with these people rather than I don't know.
More questions?
Anyone else? Issue.
Okay, Anshul asked a online question comes from the audience.
Let me see this. One of the online participants, Answashin, he writes, if the state could not find reliable villagers for policing and the idea of freedom was more pronounced following independence, does it not mean that the dominance without hegemony diminished, or in other words, the sovereignty of people increased?
See, in terms of sovereignty of the people, sovereignty in itself is constantly, a contest between people sovereignty and state sovereignty, right? In these examples, we also see that context. The idea of the state is of a post-colonial, newly independent state based on quote-unquote rule of law, and then people having different kind of agenda, right? Political agenda. So, because there is no acceptance of the premise of the new state, people are bound to resist, right? In that act of resistance, and resistance always means that whatever the state is telling you, you don't agree with it, right? You have disagreement, or your interpretation of whatever is you are told to do and to be, you don't agree with it, right? And if you don't agree with it, you resist. What is the response to resistance? Repression, right? Different gradations, and then eventually you reach domination. When hegemony is not there, what is the result? So in these circumstances, there is no hegemony because people are not agreeing with the agenda of the state. How does the state then make itself relevant? Is only through domination. So if the colonial state, as Guha would say, dominance without hegemony, in the early post-colonial state also, there is not much of a hegemony as of now. Before we attained independence, there was a certain kind of a hegemony about the idea of azadi, freedom, right? But then at the moment arrived, as it was achieved, quote unquote, at that particular moment, and we know that there are no moments when things are achieved. We are still in the process of gaining freedom, right? It is a never-ending process. If you the democratic rights and civil rights, it's an endless struggle. But even if you are not agreeing with that set template, and if you are going to resist, if you are not going to be a docile citizen, which means agreeing to all the laws that are created for you, because you have the freedom to question the laws, right? If the laws are created, they're not always created with your benefit all the time. They're created also with the sense of public order. They're created with a sense of that there should not be much of the chaos. But what is chaos? What gets defined as chaos? What gets defined as a problem? Who gets defined as a problematic person or a problematic political group? Is also these are very political considerations, right? So in that consideration, if they're not able to find reliable villagers, of course, sovereignty of people is resisting. But sovereignty of people, when resisting, is also being responded by the project of domination of the state.
But in this context, very quickly, if I may ask, on page 21 of the book you write, that the IPC, which was introduced in 1860, it can be read as an initiation of the modern social contract in India.
21 page.
Page 21. Now, I just want you to elaborate a little bit on this. It can be read as the initiation of a modern social contract in India. What is this contract, and it is between whom?
Yeah, so this is very interesting because in political science, there's something called the social contract theories. Everybody reads Hobbes, Locke, Rousseau. Hobbes, Locke, Rousseau, Hobbes, Locke, Rousseau, Hobbes, Locke, Rousseau, right? What is that contract that they're doing? And that contract between whom? It's an imaginary theoretical construct, and the main political question that is at stake there is, why should human beings, or why would human beings make themselves subservient to a political power which is external to them?
Yes.
That is the premise of social contract, right? Nobody in England signed the social contract.
True.
Nobody in France signed the social contract. Nobody in Germany signed the social
But under
contract.
colonialism, you have these subjects. I mean, a contract is, even in an abstract sense, between two parties. Which is the second party here?
The second party here is, if you look at when I say that it's a social contract, I'm also speaking from a different vantage point. My vantage point is that in 1835, Thomas Babington Macaulay in the British Parliament is given the responsibility. You're appointed as the first law commissioner. Your job is to go to India, formulate your team and draft laws, new set of laws, scientific laws, based on English temperament for this new colony, the new subjects of empire. Macaulay comes to India, sets the committee. This committee, how many law commissions are there? 7. 7 readings happen, in 7 readings, what has happened? The entire dynamic, the parameters, the paradigm of social life has transformed. Ranging from how do you identify yourself, the notions of transaction, the ownership of property, legal rights, political rights, sovereign rights, jurisdictions have changed, right? From 1835 to 1860, it is around 1860 that these 7 drafting committees sit and create what we later know as IPC, Indian Penal Code, and then in 1870s we have this Criminal Procedure Code which is tied to that. By this time, you already have, if you consider works by Elizabeth Kolsky, please remind me what is the title, the what's this? Elizabeth Kolsky's main argument? I'm forgetting it. So she's talking about that even when the British Empire was saying that it has this conception of justice and equality before law at its heart and mind when crafting this Indian Penal Code, it was not until 1890s that there was a consolidation of the Indian Penal Code. Because before that, and Elizabeth Kolsky's work tells us, there were 2 or 3 laws going on. Sirf कानून है, having law is one thing.
Yeah.
You being adjudged according to law is one thing, and everybody being equal before the same law is a different thing. So the British were treated under different laws, the white Europeans were treated under different rules, and the native, and I'm using the term native is a problematic term, but just for your understanding, the natives from the British perspective would be treated according to different laws. So there are 3 sets of laws for 3 different sets of subjects, which means the 3 different sets of subjects also have 3 different sets of legal rights and legal standing, right? It was only after the much fiasco within legality that the British Empire on paper decided that in 1890 the IPC becomes consolidated, and that I say that the rule by law, which is कानून तो है, but you will be treated by this law, you will be treated by this law, you will be treated by this law. This is rule by law. कानून तो है और तुम्हें गवर्न करेंगे अकॉर्डिंग टू इस कानून, ठीक है. बट रूल ऑफ लॉ इज दैट व्हेन द law is standardized and everybody will be subject to the same set of laws. Because earlier the people were saying, for example Europeans and British were saying, how can you treat us under the same laws when we are politically and legally superior to these people? These are colonized people and we are free people. How can you use the same set of laws to govern us? And one point of time, a person, European, he made a speech in Kolkata and he said that the people who are arguing for rule of law, they should be lynched. They should be lynched because they are talking about or talking for making the unequals equals, right? But in 1890, the law gets consolidated, and then the rule by law becomes rule of law. So,
All this is sort of progress.
sorry,
All this is sort of progress, nevertheless.
progress.
No?
Well, that needs another kind of
Another discussion.
longer conversation.
Meanwhile, Ayush has.
So let me come to the
Sure,
social contract.
please.
So when I say that it's a initiation, so I don't say that it is the establishment of a modern social contract. I use the term that it is an initiation. Initiation.
That's what he was.
So initiation, what it does is that it lays the grounds when. So let's say the colonized subject, they were playing a different kind of a legal game earlier. Now, not only the rules of the game are changed, the entire game is changed. And by game I mean the game of law. Nothing is familiar to them. The game has changed and the rules of the game, of course, are new. So in that sense, with the redefinition of this legal subjects and the legal rights in a liberal parlance, but they are not yet liberal because they do not attribute that kind of equality, that kind of a legal subjectivity to you. They still take away a lot from it, takes away more than what it gives to you. But there is a certain kind of a logic, a certain kind of a meaning to that. So that's why I say it's an initiation of a modern social contract here, which means that it is laying the foundation that by the time we reach this 1890s, where the consolidation of the Indian Penal Code happens, then we'll say, okay, now everybody is equal. That variation of the racism that was inherent in law, the differentiation that was inherent in law is gone. So now why don't everybody comes under this umbrella and accepts their legal subjectivity, because now the legal subjectivity is attributed equally. That's what I mean by, and of course 1919, 1935, different kinds of constitutional activities have already started, so that's why. So initiation is what I'm referring to, not the establishment.
Very quickly, Ayush, 2 comments.
Sir, not a comment, a question to say.
All right.
Sir, it is in continuation of what Dr. Javed just said. It is about formulation of Indian Penal Code and the British colonial idea. Sir, you used again Carl Schmitt's idea about, I could not understand the terminology here, so it is a very conceptual question. Sir, you used it in that the British colonial idea was always colonially superior and racially superior, but also you used this idea of liberal constitutional position of framework that was also imposed or put into work while formulating the Indian Penal Code, IPC. So what is that, sir?
See, Macaulay and his team, they are already working with the assumption that the British sense of creating legal reform or law reforms for this new colony is to be done on English principles, which are mostly these Benthamian principles, which is scientific in nature, which is reformist and therefore progressive in nature, right? So it is that premise on which Macaulay and his team is working, and all the following law commissioners are also working with that premise. So that's the basic foundation of this argument.
No, particularly because Dalit recovery of colonial history now is recovery the whole thing as a progressive move. Right? And it's a very, very important.
It is. It is, but I would say it is contestable. Because
That's celebrating Macaulay birthday, that's celebrating, there are going to be statues of Macaulay soon. So that is happening.
see, for students of history, the most dangerous term these days is decolonization.
That's right.
Everybody is so scared of decolonization,
Yeah.
and yet our teachers and we ourselves were embedded in the discourse of decolonization. And now in 2024, you take this name decolonization, everybody is running helter-skelter.
Yeah.
You know, no quote unquote, sir, you use the term progressive, not I. So quote unquote, any progressive, right? The moment you use the
I
term,
was particularly thinking of the emerging Dalit discourse.
it's a very important, sir. It's very important.
right?
One student has
Is there a question? Yes, please.
specifically what I have general question regarding what we are saying, like so many zero-violation that's going on in Kashmir and Palestine. So when a person follows some order or a rule, like does he lose his selfhood, like selfhood which constitutes of his own consciousness, does he lose that when he follow any order from the state?
थोड़ा सा और कुछ बताओ, मुझे समझ नहीं आया इतना.
I was because like that person, like army man, like when he
नहीं,
tortures
थोड़ा सा
someone,
louder, that's all.
when he tortures someone. So I was clear that he is following order of the state, but what about his own consciousness? Like he's seeing it's wrong, but he's still doing it. So when he follows some rule or when he follows some order, does he lose his own selfhood?
Implementing law.
देखो इसमें बड़ा इंटरेस्टिंग डिस्कोर्स है. द इंटरेस्टिंग डिस्कोर्स इज, पहले तो theoretically you can begin with reading Hannah Arendt's Banality of Evil. Like Hannah Arendt Banality of Evil में क्या है? Eichmann in Jerusalem. So Eichmann is this Nazi general.
Yeah.
He goes to the Nuremberg trials, and the judge is asking, you are accused of sending thousands of Jews to the gas chambers, right? And Eichmann say, what? I am a general. I just follow orders. Who is a good general? A good general, a good soldier, is the one who follows orders to the dots, puts dots on all the I's and crosses all the T's. He says, if I was not on this trial, for every order I have fulfilled in the most immaculate manner, I would be given a medal. I would be given an award. Right? So that's a Nazi example. Today, whether it's any military across the world, so many war contexts are going on, from Eastern Europe to Middle East to Southeast Asia, right? What militaries are doing, that logic is beyond us now. That logic is a logic of sovereignty. That logic is a logic of sovereignty itself is founded on the logic of violence. Right? It's founded on the logic of violence. India, when founded, क्या हुआ? Violence. Partition क्या है? क्या सब लोग भजन गा रहे थे? No? Violence. Spectacular. Everyday, ordinary, household, everywhere, violence. Even epistemic violence in that. And violence doesn't end there. It is still lingering in the forms of trauma. That trauma, history सारा का सारा वही है. So, I don't know इसका मैं क्या जवाब दूँ, और इसी में दूसरा 2-3 theoretical तुम्हें दे रहा हूँ, because तुम्हारे पास एक सवाल है, so उस सवाल को थोड़ा satisfy करना भी ज़रूरी है. So एक तो Hannah Arendt is important, maybe read a little bit. Then there is a critique of Hannah Arendt by Primo Levi. Primo Levi, he's a Nazi Holocaust, he's a Holocaust survivor, right? He's a Holocaust survivor, and he wrote this book of experiences in the whatever that, not gas chamber, वहाँ तक पहुँच के कोई बचा नहीं, वापस नहीं आया, in the concentration camp, right? So Primo Levi writes this book called If This Is a Man, and he says कि Hannah Arendt says that this banality of evil, bureaucratic rationality, and she kind of wriggles out of the situation. Some responsibility has to be put on the person who conducted himself in a particular manner and therefore becomes accountable for something that happened. So where is that ethic, that moral compass, that human decision making? अब उसके बाद तीसरा काम है anthropologist का, that has come from Latin America. I'm forgetting the name, but I'll give you a very simple example, which is from Hindi cinema, Bollywood. Nana Patekar, famous, encounter specialist. Very nice, kind, very loving father, very romantic husband. Goes, kills people, comes back, blood on his shirt, goes and hugs his wife in the kitchen as if nothing has happened. And the wife tells him, "You're going to meet the son, he's studying in the room. Please take off this shirt, change the shirt, and then go and meet him." One person, 3 tropes in just one scene. Encounter, blood on the shirt, loving husband, loving father. What is he? A torturer. He's a loving husband, the best father, the most good social worker in his village. And when he goes to the interrogation room, उल्टा टांग के इंसान का क्या से क्या बना देगा, क्या, I don't know. These are porous concepts.
Encounter specialist, the police person. I'm encounter specialist.
Right? This title also encounter specialist.
Javed, may I just have the last question? We are, I think, overshooting, but this tells us how stimulating the book is. Your fish in his book, Cheap Lives and Dear Lives, and you refer to that as well. He has this fairly provocative argument that compared to Islamic law and the British law, crime against property, and he's talking about the 19th century, is a bigger one than crime against human life. And there are other historians who talked about the utilitarian idea of reform. And in the 19th century, the idea that the empire is like property, I mean, with the English improving landlords, that idea being there, to be improved upon. Peter Robb and others have written on this. So this whole idea of improvement and good laws will ensure that. Would you say that when you talk of decolonization from the second decade, and you also talk about the Government of India Act, and before that as well, these are acts of decolonization. Would you say that the empire is as property and the idea of improvement is given up by the early 20th century? It's no longer paying in that sense.
I mean, I'll just give a very brief
Yeah,
response to
very.
this, and my response is that when you look at these 7 law questions, 7 law reports from 1935 to 60, how I see it is that it's a very Nietzschean kind of a transvaluation of life, objects, things, transvaluation of life itself, and
Mm.
property is one aspect of it. And the significance of the property, you yourself kind of outlined it.
Yeah.
The empire as a business project,
Yeah.
territory as a property, territory as a resource, territory as a profit making kind of enterprise. All of that is already embedded, and then taxation and all of that comes in interesting ways, and then all kinds of land owning, land taxation also becomes part of that. So yeah,
Does it leave sort of loose steam in the 20th century?
so I don't know if I can say that it has lost because the project is transvaluation, revaluing everything that existed there in its earlier form. It's imbuing it with new kinds of values.
Mhm.
By value, I mean like new kind of meaning, right?
Well, I think on that note, there's a comment?
It's an observation.
I think it's the same. Ansh. And that where is it?
ठीक है, I think this person has made a
All right.
fair comment. That's one way of looking at it.
Yes. Well, on
Important way of looking
on
at it.
this note, I think it's time to say a big thank you, not just to Javed, but to both the enthusiastic readers of this book and the chapters.
And I really want to apologize. I actually expected it to be a much more. I'm generally not so coy. I don't sit. I move around and I shout at the. Right? Some of my students are there. They can tell you.
Yeah.
This is not how I am.
But
And I really look forward to maybe coming again when I'm better.
please, you're welcome.
To interact
And
with
a
you.
big thank you for, despite not feeling that great, for this rich and wonderful
The
discussion.
importance of your voice is not diminished by the
Yeah.
volume.
Yes. So a big round of applause, I think. And thank you all for coming, sparing the time. It's late evening. And thanks to all the participants, all those people who joined online. So till next time, Javed.
Thank you. Thank
thanks
you,
a lot.
Yogesh. Thank you, Ayush.